but I see it in you, so we gon' walk it out. Move mountains. We gon' walk it out and move mountains. And I'll rise up, I'll rise like the day. I'll rise up, I'll rise unafraid. I'll rise up, and I do it 1,000 times again. And I'll rise up, I like the waves. I'll rise up, in spite of the ache. I'll rise
Hey, a
up.
last minute issue. I'm not seeing how to put my chat to everybody. It just says hosts and panelists.
The silence isn't quiet, and it feels like it's getting hard to breathe. And I know you feel like dying, but I promise we'll take the world to its feet. Move mountains to its feet. Move mountains. And I'll rise up, I'll rise like the day. I'll rise up, I'll rise unafraid. I'll rise up, and I do it 1,000 times again. That we have each other, and for that we have each other, and we will rise, we will rise, we'll rise, we'll rise. I'll rise up, rise like the day. I'll rise up, in spite of the ache. I will rise 1,000 times again. And we'll rise up, I like the waves. We'll rise up, in spite of the ache. We'll rise up, and we'll do it 1,000 times again.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. Welcome. I am Russell Rawlings. I'm the California Education Organizer at Hand in Hand, the Domestic Employers Network, and welcome to today's presentation. Communication is a two-way street, strategies for building effective care teams for family caregivers. Just a few notes on tech. Today, our webinar is being captioned live, and also ASL interpretation is being provided. To access the captions, please look at the bottom of your screen for an option to turn on captions. It may be located under the More button, located with 3 dots at the bottom of your screen. To access ASL, please click the Interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. Looks like a globe, and then choose American Sign Language, and you will be able to see the interpreters. All right, I am going to pass over to Anna, our Hand in Hand member, to begin our presentation. Anna.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I apologize in advance. My voice is a little froggy, but I'm so happy to be here with a group of family caregivers. In a minute, we'll start on our conversation about hiring and managing caregivers. But first, I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Anna Pachanti, and I'm a volunteer with Hand in Hand. And I would also like to introduce briefly my colleague, Russell, who you just heard from.
Thank you, Anna. This is Russell Rawlings. I am the community education organizer here at Hand in Hand. I'm also an employer of caregivers. I am a person with disability and have been employing caregivers for all of my adult life.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Russell. And for anyone who's joining us, if you would like to share your connection to caregiving, please do so in the chat. And additionally, I wanted to let everybody know that the presentation today is being recorded and you'll receive a recording of this via email. So you'll be able to catch up on everything we're discussing here today. Next slide, please. Wonderful. So first, we're going to discuss a little bit about Hand in Hand, and then we're going to talk about building a care team, the hiring and managing and communicating with caregivers. And then our colleague Savannah from the Alzheimer's Association will present a presentation to us on effective communication strategies for your loved one with Alzheimer's and other dementias. And then at the end, we will have a Q&A with my colleagues Russell and Tara and the rest of the panel. We are aware that we have a very large group here with us today, and so if your question doesn't get answered during this training, we will make absolutely sure to connect with you via email. Thank you. All right, so who is Hand in Hand? Hand in Hand is a national network of domestic employers, including seniors, people with disabilities and their families, who work for dignified working conditions that benefit domestic workers and employers alike. Hand in Hand also works to create long-term care system that works for all of us. We're not a referral agency, and so do not provide direct connections, but instead we seek to support current and potential home care employers by providing free tools and online resources to navigate the hiring and management process, all in an effort to create a safe, supportive, sustainable environment for everyone involved. We believe that this kind of environment will result in consumers getting the best care possible and workers getting fair and dignified working conditions. And this is our definition of success. In addition to this work, Hand in Hand is very important to me as I am a part of their caregiver support group. I have been managing the care of my father, who has a traumatic brain injury and lives in a skilled nursing home for the past about 7-8 years. So that group has been a very powerful community for me to be with people who really understand what it's like to be in this role, and we can provide empathy and support and resources for one another. And I'm happy to answer any questions about the support group later in our conversation. So, as I mentioned, Hand in Hand's website is domesticemployers.org. The top of the website looks like this, and here's where you can access many of the resources that are going to be discussed in our presentation. So on the right-hand side of the top bar, you'll see resources near the donate button. And if you click on resources, you can drop down and find all of the resources that we'll be discussing today. All right, wonderful. So a quick change in terminology. Since most people in this group are family caregivers who provide unpaid support, for the rest of the presentation, we'll try to refer to paid workers we hire as home care workers. Some people receive support through publicly funded programs and other pay for home care workers directly. This information will primarily focus on communication strategies and apply to all of these groups. So why might we want to hire someone to support us and our family member or loved one in our home or theirs? The simple answer is that we all know that caregiving can sometimes be an overwhelming and exhausting process, but our goal is to really help you get the support you need to make the caregiving journey a bit easier. So when we think about building our care team, we first want to discuss how to set a foundation for success through effective communication strategies. We've broken down these effective communication strategies into a 3-part framework, all of which we're calling the Clear and Respectful Communication Framework. This framework consists of a work agreement with you and your home care worker, regular check-ins to evaluate how things are going, and an annual evaluation where the parties involved can discuss how the year has gone. And before we begin to look at all of these parts in depth, first we want to acknowledge a larger context for the strategies that we're going to be proposing today. Hand in Hand feels that it's very important for all of us to better understand not only the needs of the person who is receiving care, but also the history of home care work as a profession. So when we're thinking about a home care worker, we want to make sure we understand the history of home care work itself. For example, you might not know that people of color and undocumented people are a large percentage of the home care workforce. And before we hire someone, it can be helpful to better understand and be curious about the history of home care work, which can be deeply rooted in certain types of oppression. When thinking about our loved one, we also want to acknowledge ableism and ageism, which are 2 forms of discrimination based on someone's age and someone's ability. It can be really helpful to know that while providing and receiving care, this may be the first time that you or your loved one encounter this type of discrimination. And this can be a really challenging and difficult experience for everyone involved. And I know it's something that my dad and I have experienced quite a bit. Communication about all of these issues can be very complicated, but they can be also very helpful in really being able to communicate effectively with one another. And we believe that these hard conversations are very worthwhile in the pursuit of creating a respectful and dignified working condition for everyone involved. Next slide, please. Okay, oops. I think we, wonderful, thank you so much. All right, so back to our 3-part framework. So how do we build a work agreement between you as the employer and a home care worker? Well, when starting this process, it's really important that we first make a practical list of existing and future needs, and this list is called a care task list. We start this list by thinking about all of the day-to-day tasks, routines, specific times your loved one needs assistance, regularly scheduled social activities, and medical appointments. You'll want to ask yourself, what happens every day and what happens infrequently? How long do these tasks take? All of this make up a care task list. Additionally, it's important to think about times when you or your loved one's schedule might need to be modified, such as when your loved one is sick or the home care worker is unavailable. What might your support look like during those times? And what are some of the options that might be available to you as a backup plan? All right, so when building your work agreement, you might also want to consider your home care workers' needs as well as your legal obligations as an employer, which can vary from state to state. And this information, as well as so many other resources, can be found on Hand in Hand's website. Other work agreement components could include, primarily for people who paid privately, planning for paid sick leave and paid time off. This work is so demanding, it's important to factor in these types of components into a work agreement. Additionally, if needs need to change, you might need to reassess to make a larger care team or modify the schedule in some way. Discussing these scenarios gives you and your home care worker the flexibility to make adjustments as needed. Another important factor to discuss with your home care worker is salary. And this can be really hard to determine and might look different whether you're employing a professional, a neighbor, a friend, etc. But either way, the home care worker needs a wage that works for them. One tool that can be really helpful in determining salary is something that MIT came up with called a living wage calculator. And you can see an example here on the right-hand side of the slide. The living wage calculator allows you to search any region in the US, and it shows the hourly rate individuals must earn to support themselves, as well as the average cost of expenses such as food, housing, and transportation, and average salaries by industry. All of this can be really helpful information in giving you an idea of what type of salary would be appropriate. All right. And finally, we suggest making your work agreement an interactive process between you, your loved one, and your home care worker. A great time to discuss your work agreement components with the home care worker would be during the interview process. As I mentioned previously, sample work agreements can be found in Hand in Hand's website under resources. Okay, as we discussed, it is crucial to check in and stay in active communication with your loved one and your home care worker. As an employer, it is your responsibility, and we recommend creating opportunities for feedback and problem solving. Excuse me. First, we want to make sure that you schedule regular check-ins at a time when the home care worker is on the clock, since this is a part of their work. We would also like to provide some guidance around preparing yourself for any difficult conversations that may come up. Oftentimes, something that's used in the corporate world is something called a feedback sandwich, where if you think of the two pieces of bread as complements and the ways in which the person is enriching your life, and then the ingredients of the sandwich as the stickier conversations, the things that you need to address to help improve conditions for everyone involved. So one thing that is important to remember, as we kind of touched upon previously, is although these conversations can be really difficult, something wonderful can always come out of difficult conversations. And tips and tools for these conversations can be found on Hand in Hand website, as well as the website called The Conversation Project, which sets up and provides guidance for an entire array of really difficult conversations. Further communication strategies will be presented later by our colleague Savannah from the Alzheimer's Association. Okay. The third and final step of the clear and respectful communication framework is the annual review. An annual review is a time to reflect on the working relationship and acknowledge the value that a home care worker is bringing to you, your loved one, and your family. During the annual review, you may want to refer back to the work agreement, highlight the value of the home care worker brings to your family, and prepare for the year ahead. Are there any travel plans, goals, other events and issues? And optionally, you may want to use this time to discuss salary. An excellent time to have an annual review is around the holidays or the end of the year, whatever feels comfortable to you. If you're not privately employing a home care worker, this can also be a great time to commit yourself to advocacy work, protections for workers, increased wages, etc. On a personal note, I have found that managing the care of my father has made me really passionate and invested in the type of advocacy work that Hand in Hand does, because I want to make sure that the people who care for my dad are receiving fair and working conditions for themselves, because I appreciate what they're doing so very much. Next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so now on to the practical business of finding a home care worker. First, it may be helpful to try to develop an ad to give a clear picture of what the person requires, the type of support that they need. So with an ad, you can briefly share about your loved one. You can highlight the task list, duties, any special requirements that your loved one may need. The best way to find your home care worker is to ask your community. Some of the best caregivers might not have a lot of experience per se in doing the job, but they may really have a calling to do this work. And additionally, there may be people already in your orbit who have sought out or previously hired a home care worker, so you can rely on their guidance and their lessons learned. And so where to look for a home care worker in your community? A great place to start is with social groups, churches, families, neighbors, to put an announcement on social media through Craigslist, Facebook groups, neighborhood groups, and also to see if there are any universities within your region that might have an opportunity to find someone. I know that this process might feel very overwhelming, but if you can rely on the guidance of groups like ours and other people in your extended community, it can make this journey a little bit easier. One thing that I often like to say is that it's not always your job to know the answer, but to find the person that knows the answer. And I hope you can rely on Alzheimer's Association and Hand in Hand and people in your community to help you find that answer. Next slide, please. Wonderful. And a part of relying on others could mean joining one of Hand in Hand's peer support groups. First, we have the monthly caregiver support group led by our colleague Kayla, who's with us today, and I'm a part of that group. And then we also have our attendant employer support group and education committee, which my colleague Russell can tell you more about later in the session. Additionally, some of the other resources that are available on our website include employer resources. For example, we have the ableism, ageism fact sheet, the guide to developing a care task list, how to place an ad and find a home care worker, as well as lots of sample contracts and something called the employee checklist, which is a questionnaire which is designed to help you create a working relationship that is mutually beneficial and supportive for everyone involved. And just a quick note, some of the documents online are in Spanish, but at the moment, most of them are available in English, and Hand in Hand is working really hard to create all of these resources in multiple languages. Lastly, we'd love to invite you to take action. We invite you to join us in transforming care by sharing your commitment to developing respectful employment practices, to take a pledge to commit to a clear, respectful communication with your employed care workers. And please note, in addition to the other resources shared in this presentation, Hand in Hand is constantly developing new educational materials. So the pledge that I spoke of, taking this pledge connects you to additional resources, community support, but it is not a one-side commitment. We want you to know that we are all in this together, and we will continue to send you tips and opportunities to connect with one another, other employers, and care workers. So we have a poll that I believe is going to be in the chat, talking about putting some of these ideas in practice. Here we go. I can see the poll. I hope you can as well. Thank you so much, Russell, for putting the poll in the chat.
Thank you. And we're just asking folks to take just a moment to commit to trying something that's been learned in the workshop today. I see that folks are responding. Wonderful. We'll give this just another minute or two, and then I will share the results. I really appreciate you taking a moment to clicking and responding on a practice that you're ready to integrate. Give this just one more minute. I see folks are responding. Thank you. Great, thank you. I'm going to share the results now and we'll move on to our final slide.
Wonderful.
I'm also going to share one final resource that we have just developed, hot off the presses, and this is a complete overview of everything we've shared today. This is a complete guide to hiring and managing caregivers for yourself and loved ones. You'll see that link in the chat. And again, we will be sending out all of this information in a follow-up email. Here are the results from the poll.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to everyone who participated.
Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. I wanted to thank everyone again for being here today. And now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Savannah. Savannah is a program and education manager for the Alzheimer's Association California Southland chapter, and she oversees all support groups, education, and care consultations in the greater San Fernando Valley. So thank you everyone again very much, and I'll turn it over to you, Savannah.
Thank you so much, Anna. It's a privilege to be here with all of you today. As Anna mentioned, I am from the Alzheimer's Association. I'm here based in Los Angeles, but we are a nationwide nonprofit, and our vision is a world without Alzheimer's and all other dementia. Today, we're going to be talking about effective communication strategies. And so we're just going to wait till we get into presenter mode for this presentation, but I'm looking forward to sharing some of my tips with you today. So let's move to the next slide. Okay, so some of our program goals today are going to be to explain the communication changes that take place through the course of the disease, to decode the verbal and behavioral messages delivered by someone living with dementia and respond in ways that are helpful to the person. And third is to identify strategies to help you connect and communicate at each stage of the disease. So what's really important is to understand that communication comes in all forms. It's not just verbal. It can be body language, your tone of voice, your facial expressions, and how someone with Alzheimer's and other dementia receives that communication and information is very important to how they're going to respond to you. And as the disease progresses, they're less and less able to take on the ability to understand the verbal communication. So it's going to be more and more important to really make sure that you're understanding how you're communicating in different ways. Next slide, please. Okay, so today we are going to be talking about communication changes throughout the disease stage. So we're going to review what it's like to communicate with an individual who's in the mild stage of this disease, moderate and severe. We're going to get into this very deeply into each stage. So I'm just going to move to the next slide at this point. Okay, so we're going to focus in on the early stage. And so in the early stage, you may not notice that many changes at all, but you may start noticing the following things. Individuals may have difficulty finding the right word, right? So they may struggle to find the word, but then find it a little bit later on. Taking longer to speak or respond. So it just may take longer for them to process what you're saying and then be able to respond to that. So having a lot of patience in those conversations is very important. Withdrawing from conversations is very common. So unfortunately, sometimes in the early stage, you may see individuals withdraw from social situations because they're embarrassed to be in that environment because they'd have to speak or respond in a way that is quicker than they're comfortable with. And then the last one is struggling with decision-making or problem solving. So starting for it to be harder for them to make those everyday decisions that seem sort of easy for them in the past. So that can be the start of what's going on in the early stage. Next slide, please. So right now we're going to hear from Martha Turney. She's at the National Alzheimer's Association office, and she's going to talk a little bit about how important it is to talk to those in the early stage and give them the agency to decide if you're going to provide the right word for them, or you're going to give them the space to answer on their own. So it's really important to keep those lines of communication open in the early stage. So go ahead and play that video.
Communicating in the early stages of dementia with the person with the disease is important. At that time, you still have language as a tool, so you can learn things about what they might prefer as the disease progresses. For example, as the disease progresses, a person might have difficulty finding words. Caregivers often struggle to know what to do in that moment. Early on in the disease, you can ask. You can say, you know, if you ever have trouble coming up with a word, would you rather that I jump in and give you the word, or do you want me to wait and allow you some time so you can find it on your own?
Yeah. So Martha makes a great point, right? So just not making that assumption that that there may be, an answer that they want to come up with on their own, and so just giving them that patience is really important. So other ways that you can communicate in the early stage is, ask them directly how to help, with communication pieces. You want to keep those sentences very clear and straightforward. So, you telling them a laundry list of things, it's going to be harder for them to process that. Leave plenty of time for conversations, right? So if you're running out the door and you're trying to have an important conversation, that's probably not the best time. So make sure you give yourself some time. And then including that person in the conversation is extremely important. Whether it's in a medical conversation, a legal or financial conversation, it's very important that they be involved, especially if it's for their future. So do not discount that. And then a lot of times doctors will just talk to the caregivers, and it's very important that the doctor talk to the individual with the disease. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're moving into the middle stage. So in the middle stage, an individual might have increased difficulty finding the right word. So basically things that were happening in the early stage may be exacerbated. Using familiar words repeatedly, because their vocabulary is going to start shrinking, and so they're just going to go back to those words more and more. Even inventing new words to describe familiar things. So an example of this could be, we talk about a spatula, they might call it a food flipper. They can't really figure out that particular word. Easily losing train of thought. So they were talking about something, and then they're talking about something completely different because they're starting to forget what they had just talked about. But in general, if they were starting to speak less frequently in the early stage, that will continue. And then we start to see a lot of behaviors in the middle stage, because if you're not able to speak verbally to express yourself, you might start seeing more agitation, more anxiety, confusion, aggression if needs aren't met. So things of that nature. Aggression is only going to happen for an individual with Alzheimer's if there's sort of a trigger piece of it. So that's very important to note as well. But it's important to think about that if there is a major or sudden change, definitely talking to the medical provider of that individual is incredibly important, because it could be a UTI, it could be a medication issue. So we want to make sure that it's not that if it's very sudden, because this is usually a progressive disease. And of course it gets worse over time, but if it gets dramatically worse over the course of a day or two, it's definitely something you need to bring to the doctor. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's Beverly. She's a caregiver for a support group. Her husband has had Alzheimer's disease, and she's talking to caregivers in general about how you just have to have a lot more patience, especially with individuals in the middle stage, and how that relationship between sort of a wife and her husband has changed. Let's hear from Beverly.
I would advise couples, and I usually do advise the caregiver who comes to the group and is caring for a spouse, that you take your time. Always count to 3 before you respond. because it gives you time to think about your answer and what's going on. Generally, in a marital dispute, it's quick. It's back and forth. You're quick to give an answer. When they've been diagnosed, to sit back and say, okay, you're supposed to be the one that's reasonable here. Let's change how we do this, because there's only one thing you can control, and that's you. You cannot control them and their process.
That's very important, and it's very difficult because the nature of the relationship is changing. But the more you can understand as a caregiver that you're going to have to sort of make adjustments and changes, because what's happening for them is a progressive brain disease. And so unfortunately, that is the trade-off there. But continuing in the middle stage, you just have to make sure that you're approaching them gently, especially if it's someone who's a paid caregiver. They may not know them as well. So it's really important that they come in and introduce themselves by name, get down on their level and make eye contact. You never want to approach from the back. Avoiding criticizing, correcting, or arguing is very important. Those in the middle stage, their judgment, their logic, their reasoning have most likely been impaired. And so a lot of times it's important, even if they think something is going on, that you not argue with them, because their sense of reality has changed. And so it is very important that you don't get into that back and forth of this isn't happening, and they're saying yes it is, and back and forth. You also want to pay attention to your tone. Your tone of voice matters a lot, because again, their verbal comprehension is decreasing. And so if you can stay at a certain tone, that's going to be very important, so that they're not sensing your tension, your stress. They're going to respond to that. Just take your time. I mean, over and over again, patience comes up as a very important part of being a family or paid caregiver in this regard. Next slide, please. So this is Rebecca. Rebecca's mom does have Alzheimer's, and what she's doing is adjusting herself to this new reality with her mother's disease. Go ahead and play that video.
She could sense my frustration, because occasionally I would lose my patience and I would bark at her. Why are you asking me that question again? I just answered that question 2 minutes ago. And then she would get frustrated because, she was very old school, and she's like, don't disrespect me. And I didn't ask you that question 2 minutes ago. It's a new question. So phase 2 of our relationship was like, okay, that's a new question. I'll answer it again.
Right. So the lesson to take from that is that for them, it's the first time that they're asking that question. And so being able to recognize that and saying, oh, I need to have patience with this and answer the question again is very important, even though it's extremely difficult. Next slide, please. Okay, so communication in the middle stage, other things to note, right, is joining that person's reality, as we've talked about, making sure that you're understanding where they're coming from and assessing their needs. So what we say by assessing the person's needs is they may not be able to verbally tell you, I'm thirsty, I'm hungry, I need to go to the bathroom, basic needs anymore. It depends on the person, but you want to make sure that those needs are met. Let the person know that their concerns are valid, right? Through whether they're expressing them verbally or through behavior. So they may be, not wanting to get in the shower. That's very common. And then you assess, okay, is the shower too hot, too cold? Is it that they're feeling embarrassed, that they're naked? Whatever the situation is, doing that assessment is very important, because you're trying to understand, what's this behavior? They're not telling me anything, but I'm trying to assess what's going on. Continuing to provide brief answers and then responding to those emotions behind the statement. A lot of times you'll hear with an individual who has Alzheimer's, they say, I want to go home, and they may be home already. But the emotion behind that statement is, I don't feel safe, I don't feel comfortable. What's going on here? So reassurance that they are safe, that they are with you, that you're going to keep them safe is very important to them, because there's an emotion behind that statement. Instead of saying, you are home, that's not going to work. So moving on to the next slide. Okay, so continuing in the middle stage, especially because they spend the longest time in the middle stage, it's also important to really focus in on this particular disease stage. So you want to keep things short, basic, very clear, one question at a time. Limit distractions is so important. If the TV is on and there's a trash truck outside and you're trying to get a point across, it's going to be very difficult. So definitely limit those distractions. And at this point, patience is a virtue, and you'll have to offer the word to fill in, as opposed to the early stage where it's more of that choice. A lot of times they will not be able to find that word again. So filling that in is acceptable. Next slide, please. Okay, so cueing in the middle stage is very important as well. Any visual cues you can give, whether it's with maybe a calendar or notes, writing things down can be very helpful. Avoiding any sudden movements, putting answers into your questions, right? So instead of saying, what do you want for lunch? And that really opens up a whole Pandora's box. It's say, do you want ham or turkey for lunch? So that way they can decide, and you give them some choice, or they could even point to it if they don't have that verbal ability. But that's important. And then turning negatives into positives. So maybe they didn't want to shower, but it's like, if we get all clean, we can go see your daughter, Cindy. So that makes it into a positive that they can get there. So a lot of times we try to use that. And avoiding quizzing. You never want to say, don't you remember I told you yesterday you have a medical appointment yesterday or today? It's not going to work out. So avoiding quizzing is key. And it's also disrespectful, because it is the first time that they're hearing this information in their reality. So it is inappropriate. And next slide, please. Okay, so continuing through the middle stage, just providing that reassurance is everything, that you're there, that you're hearing them, that you understand that you're giving them that respect is so important. Focusing on those feelings and not the facts, and validating, and then redirecting. So, if they're getting agitated or confused, a lot of times, if they like to go sit outside or take a walk, or you distract them with some photographs of their family, whatever works is very important to really soothe them. Next slide, please. So now we're moving on to the late stage. In the late stage, of course, the disease is at work and it is progressive. And so communication does get highly diminished in this stage, where it may just be down to a few words or sounds, maybe a couple phrases. So it's going to be more important for you to assess their comfort and their safety level in this stage. It's definitely harder to connect, but it doesn't mean you can't connect. The way to connect, we'll talk about later, but it's through the 5 senses. But it's important just to keep talking, even if they're not talking back, because they can hear you, and you want to provide that reassurance that you are there. So bringing that respect to them, as the adult that they are, making sure that that they're still in there. So let's move on to the next slide. So this is Sandra. Her mom is in the late stages of Alzheimer's, and this video really talks about how she had to really come to terms of new ways to interact in her relationship with her mother. So go ahead and play that video.
I know that my mom feels aggravated. I know that she feels alone. I know that she feels confused. And I know on any given day, I don't know if I've made it better for her. I try. In these later stages, I've come to recognize that being really aware of the 5 senses is really important. Touch seems to give her a great deal of comfort. I know when I come over, I'm going to brush her hair all the time. My husband noted to me recently, he said, you should see the look on your mom's face when you're brushing her hair. She's just happy. She's just happy. She doesn't say a lot. And I do it for a long period of time. I comb it, I braid it, I do funny things with it, but it just allows me to just be with her in a way that makes her feel comfortable.
So, I mean, it is very heartbreaking, of course, what's happening along the disease progression, but it does give the individual with the disease a lot of comfort through these different ways to interact, as Sandra talked about. So I'm going to go through these somewhat fast, just because I know we're limited on time and we want to get to the Q&A. So just know that there's a lot of different ways, of course, to connect through the 5 senses, but you can always connect through touch. So, and a good example of this would be giving a hand lotion massage. People usually find that very comforting. So that could be one way to do it through touch. Next slide. Another one could be through sight. So if that individual likes nature, you know, getting them outdoors and sitting and watching the birds could be one of their favorite things. Of course, if they don't like nature, maybe that's not the right choice for them. You have to definitely go based on what that individual always enjoyed. So looking at what those different options could be to connect through sight. Next slide, please. Connecting through sound. So what does that individual enjoy? Do they like certain music? Do they like the sound of your voice reading them their favorite poem? What is it that makes sense for that person? Next slide, please. Connecting through smell. So smell can be extremely powerful, right? When you smell your favorite pizza or you smell your favorite flower, it brings you a lot of joy. So again, going back to that person's preferences is very important. Next slide. Connecting through taste. I don't need to tell all of you that, you know, having something that you like to eat brings a lot of joy, right? So if that person really loves cupcakes or ice cream, or I'm big on salty things, so you know, whatever that looks like for them, it can bring happiness to them in the late stage. Next slide. So this is really a high level of sort of how you should approach communication in all stages of the disease, right? So joining that person's reality to connect, right? To make sure that you understand that their reality is changing, and what you can do is respond in a respectful, patient manner and not argue is critical. Understand and accept what you cannot change, right? They are changing. So you also, as a result, have to change your approach. That the person is who they've always been despite the disease, right? So making sure that you give them that respect, treating them as the adult that he or she is, right? So it's very common for individuals to patronize people with this disease, and that really shouldn't be happening, because they are still an adult and still have had a lifetime of experience. We want to try to decode those communications, whether it's through behaviors or through, you know, a word or two. It really ends up being the responsibility of the caregiver to try to find what's going on. So you want to basically understand those sorts of reactions, and then anything that's soothing or calming, especially with the 5 senses in the later stages, but also along the disease progression, can be very effective. Next slide, please. So this is a video from Sam Fazio, and he's going to talk a little bit about what it means to have self-care as a caregiver taking care of a loved one with Alzheimer's.
Taking care of yourself while you care for somebody with the disease not only impacts your own health, but it really can impact the person with the disease. So for example, if you're not getting enough sleep, you might be easily irritated, which will then sort of spill over to your interactions with the person with the disease, and maybe being short with them, which then might cause them to get frustrated. So it's not only important to take care of yourself for your own health, but really for you to really be a good caregiver.
Okay, so that self-care piece, I cannot emphasize how important that is. So we're going to talk about some resources so that you can try to find some support through the Alzheimer's Association, but also just finding things that you enjoy if you're able to take some breaks throughout the day or the week to try to center yourself is very important. So under our online resources, we have alz.org. That is our national website. You'll find a lot of different resources under that umbrella. One of them being our on-demand education programs at training.alz.org. So that where you can find English and Spanish education for free. Just like this information, it's there for you. We also have something called the Alzheimer's Navigator, and that's building your own action plan for an individual with Alzheimer's. Community Resource Finder is a resource with AARP by zip code that you can find local resources, whether it's an in-home care or an assisted living. We have something called ALZ Connected, which is a chat peer-to-peer forum where you can read threads or post questions, both for caregivers as well as those in the early stage of this disease. We have an entire caregiver center as well as a safety center that is truly a wealth of information. I can't really emphasize that enough. I always say use the search function because we have really a massive website that has so many resources. So I hope it is helpful to you. We have a 24/7 helpline as well, that 800 number, 800-272-3900. It's in over 200 languages. It's 24/7, 365 days a year. So please do access that and talk to a master clinician if you do need support, whether as an individual with the disease, a caregiver, or a professional. Anyone can access that. We have numerous in-person and virtual support groups throughout the country, as well as educational programming. So please look into that as well to continue to access our resources. Next slide, please. There's numerous ways to get involved. I'm going to do a very high-level overview, but I do hope you look into this as well. We have our Walk to End Alzheimer's, which is actually happening nationwide this fall. So we have a lot in October, November. At alz.org/walk, you can find by zip code that you can look at which walk is closest to you, and that's a great access point to community resources. We have the ability to volunteer with us, to be involved as an educator or a support group facilitator, or get involved with the walk committee. So there's that as well. We have Trial Match by zip code. You can find clinical studies and trials all over the country. And we do have advocacy at every single level, local, state, and federal to really advocate on behalf of those with this disease and their caregivers. Next slide, please. Well, we're at questions. So hopefully we have enough time for that Q&A section, both with Anna as well as myself. But I do encourage, again, please write this number down, the 24/7 helpline or the website. It really is a gateway to numerous resources that we have for individuals out there nationwide. So thank you so much for this opportunity and time, and I look forward to this Q&A section.
Thank you, Savannah. I am going to now turn this portion of the conversation over to Tara Polanski, our education director here at Hand in Hand, to help give us some questions. And I also want to give everyone just a reminder and an opportunity to share and converse with us. There are two ways you can do this. You can do this in the bottom of the screen. There's a Q&A button. You can click the Q&A button and type in a question. You can also simply type into the chat if that's easier for you, and then we will answer some questions.
Okay, I'll read a couple questions that have come in the Q&A. Do you have any tips or guidance on how to persuade someone to allow a caregiver into the home? My father needs extra care. His wife provides, but we want her to have some help and time off. We want her to have some help and time off as his condition worsens. Neither is interested in having any stranger in their home. Can anybody speak to that?
I can go ahead and speak to it. So, we get this a lot, right? People are hesitant to get that extra care in the home. It really depends on the approach for that individual. So if they feel, oh, you know, I don't want help, right? I don't need help. A lot of times you have to approach it from from a different angle of, it's not for you, it's for me to have time off, or whatever the nature of that dynamic is, or it's or there's therapeutic fibs, unfortunately, that we have to use in this disease of, they're helping with this or they're helping with that, but what they're really doing is being there to help that individual. So there's a lot of different techniques, but it is sort of trying to figure out what makes the most sense for that particular individual, because it can be so tricky, but it just depends. But if you do have those types of questions, it could get so niche that I recommend calling our 24/7 helpline, because they could strategize with you, particularly for the individuals that you're dealing with, and give you some good advice there.
Thank you. Another question, do you have resources to recommend for Alzheimer's in bilingual people? We assume my father will eventually revert to his first language, but any guidance on negotiating that transition would be very helpful.
So we do have a lot of different information in many different languages. We call them sort of our information sheets. So that's one option, definitely, everything from stopping to drive to incontinence to wandering, we have in multiple different languages. It obviously depends on the language, but we do have them. We have a lot of resources in Spanish, if that is the language we're talking about. We can convert our entire website into Spanish. Of course, you can do training on demand in Spanish. We have support groups in Spanish. And then we also have, we just have our master clinicians that can talk to you either in English and Spanish immediately, and then in over 200 languages after that. So it's just very important that you start either with our website or our master clinicians that can really point you in the right direction.
Are there any other questions? Do you have any Spanish-speaking therapists in Manhattan?
Well, I'm sure there are. Unfortunately, I am located here in Los Angeles, but what I would recommend you do is you call the local office in New York, and there are staff that do what I do there. It's called the Care and Support Team, and they could direct you to more local resources there. So you can request what's called a care consultation for free, and hopefully they'll be able to direct you. But I would start with alz.org, and then you can search for your chapter there.
And one clarifying question is just really about how to negotiate struggles with language as transitions happen. So in this case, as this person's father struggles with language when he transitions back from English, do you have any suggestions or resources related to that more specifically?
I guess I'm a little confused about the question. I guess I would need clarification from this individual as to what they need support for.
It seems like maybe it's more specific and could be good to call the helpline.
Yeah, probably. I just wanted to clarify my question. I'm asking about the individual who has Alzheimer's as he forgets how to speak English. If you had any advice or any resources you could point us to on how to negotiate that, because you talked about the struggles with language as they forget words, but when they're dealing with multiple languages in their head at the same time, it seems like that's a whole other thing that's going to happen. I don't speak his language. So it's kind of that whole thing. And I think that's actually quite common with children of immigrant families. It's not exactly a niche problem. So I was wondering if you had any, I wasn't asking about how to get information in the other language, though that is also helpful because of his wife, but how to help us as his children communicate with him and how to understand what might be going on in his head.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I do want to validate that, yes, it's very common for individuals to revert to their native language, the language that they grew up speaking, in childhood. So that doesn't surprise me at all that he'd revert back to that. It is, of course, difficult if, there's that language barrier there between you and him and your siblings as well. I think I would work with translation apps, or if he can still write in another language, like try different potential ways that you could go with it. It is going to be very challenging. I definitely can't discount that, but I think there could be potential tools and apps and different ways through communication to get that across, but definitely challenging. And we do, master clinicians would only help so much as he could talk to them in his native language, but that communication between the two of you will be challenging. But I recommend trying at least different possibilities, because you want to try to at least maintain some kind of communication until he may not be able to anymore.
Thanks. And just one more question before we wrap up. There's a question about showering, which you started to talk about, Savannah. This participant is saying that they struggle with this and asking, can you talk more about some of the issues with showering?
Sure. Yeah, this is extremely common. We have entire section of this on our website, and then I also recommend that UCLA has some videos on this that you could look into. But essentially, individuals with this disease may be fearful because they may not, sort of understand the process of showering anymore. So what I would do is make sure that you're very gentle in this process, right? So if it's that the declothing piece is you can see they're getting agitated, try a different approach there. If you see that they're getting agitated because the water is too hot, maybe try adjusting the water. If they don't like standing, try getting them a seat in the shower. If they don't, if they aren't liking showering, you can try different approaches. You could try a bath. You could try, sort of sponging them off, because it is sort of that fear of the unknown for them, because it doesn't feel comfortable anymore. So that's the experience. And so trying different things and being assessing what's going on there is critical. But thank you for that question.
I think that's it for the questions for today.
Thank you. Thank you to Hand in Hand as well for putting this together.
I'd really like to say thank you to the entire team today as well. Thank you to Anna and Savannah and Tara for assisting us today. Also, my colleague, Kayla Shore, and our interpreters and captioner today for providing support to this meeting. As I mentioned at the top of the meeting, this information will be going out in a follow-up email. We'll share all of our presentation materials, the links, and ultimately the recording as well. Thank you to all of you for being a part of this project. We have more exciting information to share ahead with you as well, a training series that will be available. And again, we've just developed a comprehensive guide that you can read and follow along for hiring caregivers here at Hand in Hand. So I'm really excited to be sharing that with you. Literally went on our website today. So thank you again for staying engaged with us. Look forward to seeing you all in the future. And thank you again to the Alzheimer's Association for being such a wonderful partner and bringing an additional depth to our work and ability to connect with community.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice rest of your day.